Sean Spicer and Scaramucci, we know that Chief of Staff Reince Priebus was not pleased with the possible appointment of Scaramucci at White House Communications Director. So really a seismic shift for this White House at a time where they've come under siege with this Russia investigation. So today, coming out of the White House, Press Secretary Sean Spicer resigning. He will no longer be at that podium that he's become so famous for being behind. John?
Jessica Snyder, we'll get back to you at the White House. Continue your reporting. We'll come back to you as developments warrant. Let's come back in the room. And again, let's try to put this in a bit of context in the sense that Sean Spicer is one person who serves the president. The president has a big staff. But as you listen to Jessica go through the anatomy of how this plays out, the president's chief of staff did not want this to happen. The president's chief of staff, the gatekeeper to the president. In most White Houses, and this White House functions differently. I covered the White House for 10 years. This White House functions differently than any White House I'm familiar with in almost 30 years here in Washington. But the chief of staff is the gatekeeper. If the chief of staff can't get his way, and I'm going to bring Dana Bash back into the conversation as well, if the chief of staff can't get his way on a major personnel issue, Dana, what does it tell us about the continuing internal infighting in Trump land?
Well, I think it's infighting, but I think it's also something much more prominent that this reminds us of, that the President of the United States is very much in charge of his communication strategy. And let's just face it, if he could get the title of Communications Director, maybe that would be the most appropriate title for him to share with with it also being President of the United States. I just got off the phone with somebody who's familiar with Sean Spicer's thinking, who told me that when it became clear that Scaramucci was going to be the communications director, Sean said, wait a second, if that is the case, if his title is communications director, then that effectively means that I, Sean, will probably be doing two jobs, both spokesperson and communications director. For those who, out there who may not understand, communications director is supposed to be more strategic thinking, looking ahead, crafting the message, as opposed to just delivering the message. And the reason he kind of settled on that realization is because Scaramucci has no experience in communications. He has no experience in Washington. He has no experience in that kind of strategy. And so Sean said, you know what? This is the last straw. He made the decision, I think, today when it became official, and he said, I'm out of here. The other thing, John, that this also it underscores and underlines and highlights is how important the television presence is to President Trump. The representation that he has on camera, on TV, is so critical. That he, the president, wanted Scaramucci out there because he loves him on TV. He's a killer, which is what he calls him behind the scenes. And he's always wanted Scaramucci, who he's been close with since the New York days, in the administration, and has been trying to figure out a way to do it. Communications director, the title was open. He, the president, likes Scaramucci on TV, so he brought those two together. And this, after everything that we have seen, the topsy-turvy world of Sean Spicer as White House press secretary, it was this that was the final straw.
Dana Bash, appreciate that. Stick around and continue your reporting as we do. Let's come back to the room. Again, to this point, it's a very different president and a very different structure in the White House in the sense that the communications director in most administrations is behind the scenes. They're looking at the calendar and says, Mr. President, you hit the 6-month mark on Friday. We're going to have you do this event. We're going to have Republican governors do this event. The cabinet's going to fan out and do this. You're going to go do a big speech on this. Boom, boom, boom. It's more of a strategic planning behind the scenes role. But the president, you were making this point, we were having the conversation earlier as this was breaking, the president watches cable news in the morning. Anthony Scaramucci is a frequent guest on CNN's New Day, and he's a very effective, he's a very effective spokesman for this president. And I say this as a compliment. He does combat with the news anchors when he thinks he should do combat. He talks about the president. He has also been at times candidly critical of the team at the president's side up until today, which includes Sean Spicer.
That's right, and the president values that. That's why he likes Kellyanne Conway so much, because she's willing to go on camera and joust with whoever is trying to criticize the White House, and more particularly the president. This is also a moment, though, isn't this the time when this White House needs to be the most sort of unified, with all the oars rowing in the same direction, with the Russia probe growing exponentially? And yet this is highlighting just how the schism that's in there. This is a president who loves chaos. He likes tumult. He did in the business world. He did in the campaign. He likes having rival factions underneath him, but this might be a moment where he's not well served by that strategy.
It's a great point. The question is this a reset?
Right.
6 months in, new administrations, the president had no experience in politics. None of the people around him had ever worked in a White House before, the senior people in the administration. Is this a reset where the president realizes, okay, we haven't been getting this right and we have a new team? Or is Mr. Scaramucci about to become the latest person the president gets mad at?
Right.
We were going to start the show with it. He's been mad at his outside attorney, Mark Kasowitz, so he shakes up the legal team. He's been mad at Sean Spicer, so he puts Sarah Huckabee Sanders more in the forefront and pulls Sean Spicer back. He was mad at Reince Priebus. He was at one time mad at Steve Bannon. Yeah. Is this just Scaramucci's turn to have the president be mad at him, or is this part of a more strategic reset for an administration that 6 months in, Obamacare is the law of the land. They're nowhere on tax reform. They're nowhere on infrastructure, and you have a special counsel investigation that is blossoming.
Yeah, does he essentially just enable the president in his essentially flawed communication strategy? I mean, you think about what he did this week, supposed to be about healthcare. He gives this a very long interview to the New York Times where he trashes Jeff Sessions. I mean, is Scaramucci going to be the person who can say, no, Mr. President, you're not going to sit in an interview alone?
The answer is no.
Right?
The evidence is that the answer is no. That the president would go into the Oval Office with Hope Hicks and the New York Times reporting team, and the rest of the senior White House staff, including his outside legal team, would have to find out what he said by listening to a tape recording. He has not said so publicly, but I believe with everything I've based on from conversations with friends that that's one of the reasons another key player, Mark Corallo, who was a communications guru helping the president's legal team, resigned yesterday. I understand our senior White House correspondent, Jeff Zeleny, is on the phone with us. Jeff, just help put into context, you've been covering this story from day one. Sean Spicer's up, Sean Spicer's down, Sean Spicer's on the outs. The day is finally here. There have been many for some time, including a lot of Sean's friends, who have said, how much can he take? How much will he take of being undermined by the president and pushed aside inside the White House? Well, today he resigned.
No question, John. And I think a key point here is, as we're talking to our sources in the White House, as well as Republicans close to the White House, who want this president to succeed, they say that Sean Spicer believed this morning, really for one of the first times, that the president was doing something that would not allow him to succeed. Sean is a creature of Washington. Sean believes deeply in the process and how things work, and he thought that he could be the most helpful to the president in this way. But by hiring Anthony Scaramucci, it essentially makes the point clear, which has been sort of emerging, that the president wants to be his own communications director, the president wants to be his own press secretary, and he does not want help from those in Washington. This is now more of an outside game. This is now more of a fight. This is about the Russia investigation. This is much less about the agenda here. So I think the writing has been on the wall, John, in so many different respects. I remember being at the Vatican just at the end of May when Sean Spicer was slighted by not being invited. He was hoping to be there that day. He was not invited on the trip to Paris last week. He's been disinvited from the briefing room. So in so many different slights, but I am told today the final straw was when he was effectively said he wasn't needed here because it became less of a, of what do you know about Washington game than an outside Trump game. So the walls are essentially tightening in a little bit, and it's more people from a Trump Tower, the New York world, who are here for this president.
Well, at that moment, Jeff, stand by if you can as we continue the conversation. To that point, it's interesting. If you're watching out there in America, you're watching around the world, a single staff change at the White House may mean nothing to your life. The question is, what does it do to the operation and the functioning of the presidency? The type of people who have access to the president, the strategy he takes on these big issues, whether it's how much do you cooperate? Do you continue to have people investigate and try to undermine a special counsel investigation? That's dangerous. How much do you try to bang heads and try to figure out this Republican health care mess on Capitol Hill? Or do you say, forget about it, you can't solve that, let's move on to tax reform? This is important. Who's in the room to try to advise the president? But I think one of the lessons, Jeff Zeleny hit on it, Jessica Schneider hit on it, Dana Bash hit on it, everybody at this table has hit on it, is that they make plans often, and the President of the United States is in on those plans, signs off on those plans, but then he wakes up one day, sees something on television, picks up the phone and starts tweeting, and kaboom. Is this a reset moment, or is this a continuation of the chaos moment?
This White House just functions completely differently from other White Houses, and it's taken us 6 months to see that, and it keeps happening on things like this today, on interviews that you mentioned. I mean, there are sometimes interviews that happen in the Oval Office that the communication shop doesn't know are going to happen. I mean, it's just a completely different style of governing and of running a White House. And I think it's important also to note, you're talking about Scaramucci being good on television and sparring with reporters, but the communications job is a lot more than that. Right. You have to work with the press, you have to work with the White House Correspondents Association, you have to deal with overall strategy on messaging, on who you reach out to, how you present the president's message in a very difficult environment.
And you have to have a vision, right?
In a perfect world, with the state Republican parties, with the Republican governors, with the Republican members of Congress, with the Chamber of Commerce and the National Federation of all the pieces of the Republican coalition, which 6 months into this administration has happened almost none.
And if the idea is that, I mean, again, that's the traditional way of doing things in the way that makes, strategic sense. Who's a Washington insider wants to bring in other people that are going to serve a limited role in what they do because it's all they can do, that, I mean, is a strange decision, but it might be the way he's deciding to go about things because he's pretty unorthodox.
He also values over anything the idea of loyalty.
Yeah.
And Scaramucci is someone who has been an ardent backer, although it was not an initial supporter, but has since become an ardent backer. But he's also always sort of held it against the RNC wing, which includes his chief of staff, for not fully believing in him for a while, for waffling moments during the campaign, whether Trump would be the nominee. He has teased his chief of staff repeatedly about being late to the Trump party.
Look, this also depends in large part on how much Scaramucci is able to, how much he wants to do with this job and how well he can manage up. Because as we've seen, it all depends on if you are in Trump's good graces, if he feels like you're on his side, on his team. And that hasn't worked for other people who are used to basically saying, okay, we're trying to help you here by being a little antagonistic behind the scenes. That doesn't sit well with him. So does
apropos loyalty, though, I think it's important to emphasize Sean Spicer was loyal.
Very loyal.
And if they had disagreements about strategy, we didn't see them from the podium or behind the scenes.
And in some ways damaging his own standing and credibility over these last 6 months in service of this president.
No question.
Did the president see that?
Damage his standing with reporters and long-term relationships with reporters in town to defend the president, at times saying things that we all knew were not factual and not defensible, but he did it out of loyalty to the president. You're absolutely right there. We can show you the briefing room. I believe we have some live pictures inside the White House briefing room, and I hope I haven't kept her waiting too long. I think we still have our Caitlin Collins at the White House, do we? Caitlin, if we do, I've been at the White House on days of big staff shakeups, and Sean Spicer is gone. He is one senior official at the White House, but there tends to be a domino effect either in people who work closely with him, who go with him, or just in the mood of the people in the building. Because if somebody as senior as Sean Spicer is on shaky ground, everybody gets a little jittery.
Yeah, it's been a tumultuous morning here at the White House. Sean Spicer has made it 6 months and 1 day as press secretary, but he has resigned today after Anthony Scaramucci was named as the new White House communications director. We're told Sean was unhappy with that decision, and he was kept out of the loop last night, as was Chief of Staff Reince Priebus and Steve Bannon about Scaramucci's hiring today. So today, after it was announced that he would be hired, and before they announced it to the communications team, we are told that Sean Spicer has resigned. Now, it's unclear. The White House says a statement is coming regarding Sean Spicer any minute now, and we're waiting to hear from that, and we'll certainly let you know once we have it. The White House has also said there will be a press briefing today, but we're not sure who will be briefing. We are told that Donald Trump wanted Sean Spicer to stay on as press secretary. He asked him to stay on in some role, but it's unclear what role Sean Spicer would have fulfilled here, because Sarah Sanders, as you know, has been handling most of the press briefings lately, and with Anthony Scaramucci taking on the communications job, he would be in charge of the messaging strategy coming out of the West Wing. So we're not sure what Sean Spicer would have left to do. So we are told he has resigned. He was in the room as Chief of Staff Reince Priebus welcomed Scaramucci in. We're told that though Sean Spicer is really upset, from a White House official, that he was there and said he was willing to help Scaramucci transition into the role, and gave him a round of applause.
Caitlin Collins at the White House. Keep in touch as developments warrant. To that point, Sean Spicer and I have had a few exchanges during the Trump presidency over issues, but he has always been a pro, and to Jeff Mason's point, a loyal pro. The fact that he would help with the transition, no surprise there. Just a little White House 101 for those of you watching the picture on the right side of your screen there. The reporters gathered in the briefing room. It's a little chaotic at times. That door you see there, they're all trying to point their cameras through or get a gaze through. If you step in that door and turn to the right, you're in the lower press office where the press secretary's deputies work. There are a couple of small offices there. There's a desk where that's one of the places where you get the sense of the mood in the White House. The kid at that desk right inside that door often gives you a sense of what the mood is in the White House. If you turn left and go up the stairs, if you keep going straight, you head into the West Wing and past the Oval Office. If you go up the stairs and hook to the right, then you get to the press secretary's traditional prime real estate in the West Wing. Will Anthony Scaramucci take that? Will Anthony Scaramucci take some other office in the West Wing? The communications director tends to get one without the windows, or not as prime real estate there.
Smaller office.
A smaller office. You know, we're making some light about this as we watch it, but the White House geography, White House real estate is important. As we watch Sean Spicer go and Anthony Scaramucci come in, it is just an unmistakable fact that this is also a blow to the power of the White House Chief of Staff, Reince Priebus.
Right.
What message is the President sending his Chief of Staff?
That you don't matter as much in many ways. So, I mean, there was this sort of watch for Spicer and how long he stays on. And in some ways, there has been a constant watch for Reince Priebus as well. And this, I think, is one of the biggest indications of how disempowered he is in that White House, and how this president is doubling down on that inner circle of Javanka, and now Scaramucci is apparently probably in that inner circle. I imagine if he wants a big office with windows, he might just get one.
Do we still have Jeff Zeleny, or did we lose him to reporting? Jeff Zeleny, jump into this conversation, because you have been part of this drama from day one, as well as the people sitting here at the table with me. And this was always I'll call it creative tension. Some people call it creative chaos within the Trump White House. You had a president of the United States who had a chief of staff and a press secretary, Sean Spicer, who were the Washington Republican establishment. You had Steve Bannon, who was the nationalist, America First, pitchfork wing, who was going to tell the president from time to time, no, sir, don't become hostage of that establishment. Then you have the Manhattan. Gary Cohn came in as the chief economic advisor. Jared Kushner, the son-in-law, is an ambassador with broad portfolio. Daughter Ivanka Trump represents more of the Manhattan wing. And truth be told, some of them in the past have been Democrats, and they're much more moderate when it comes to Republican policy. Does it tell us anything beyond the president thinking somebody can communicate better for him, or Sean Spicer is not communicating enough? Does this move, the dramatic resignation of the White House press secretary, tell us something about a shift inside this White House toward a different governing philosophy, or a different management or communications philosophy?
John, I think it does signify a shift that President Trump is taking all matters into his own hands, and he, increasingly everything is being run directly out of the Oval Office, not the Chief of Staff's office, just down the hallway, which is the normal course of business in a White House. That the president and the president alone is taking matters into his own hands here. And as you all were saying earlier, it is so telling that Reince Priebus, the Chief of Staff, was not involved in this decision at all. But also, one thing that is sort of shaking people inside the White House today is this is a second time in 3 days that someone who is an incredibly loyal soldier, a loyal employee, supporter of this president, has been sort of disrespected. Jeff Sessions, of course, the Attorney General, earlier this week, and now Sean Spicer. And it does send a message and raise a question to people. Gosh, if this can happen to them, what about me? So I do think your point about who sort of leaves with Spicer might be interesting. But the interesting thing here also, Sean Spicer was saying just a month or so ago that he is going to be in charge of picking his own successor. He was accepting the fact that he would not be at the press podium every day. He was accepting the fact that this would not be the traditional press secretary role as others have been in administrations gone by. But he said that he would even be perhaps a deputy chief of staff of communications. Well, it became clear to him this morning that he would not have that role, and effectively he was out of work. He would not be the press secretary, he would not be a communications director, and he certainly wouldn't be picking his successor. Many friends of his, I've been talking with some of them this morning, Republicans in Washington, wonder, gosh, why didn't he sort of resign earlier? Because he has been sort of disrespected before in their view. But today was obviously the final straw for Sean Spicer.
Right, and to that point, I believe his loyalty to the president, who he's served, and his loyalty to Reince Priebus, for whom he's worked for quite a bit of time as a partner and as a deputy, was one of the reasons he stayed so long, even when a number of friends told him for months, you should get out of there, the president is undermining you. I want to say this, though, on the record, our Dana Bash reports from Reince Priebus, a lot of conversations about his involvement in this, his maybe exclusion from this. He said, I support Anthony 100%. We go back a long way and are very good friends, all good here. That from Reince Priebus on Anthony Scaramucci coming in. I assume that is correct. I also assume there's nothing else he can say.
Right, yeah.
say on this day. Let's bring Dan Abesh back into the conversation. Again, Dan, I sound a bit like a broken record, but the question for me for this White House is, what does this mean? In the sense of, if, as Jeff notes, you have an all-consumed president who thinks he can be his own chief of staff, his own communications director, his own chief legal advisor, his own chief healthcare negotiator, his own chief tax reform negotiator, his own chief infrastructure advocate. This president is indefatigable. He works very hard, whether you like him or not. He brings a lot of effort to it. That is impossible. It just cannot be done. Is the president disserving himself? He often thinks people around him are not serving him well. Is he doing a disservice to himself here?
He might be, but the way he sees it, trying to sort of climb into kind of his perspective on these things, just having covered him for a couple of years now, is that he feels that he is at his best when he has people that he trusts and likes and respects around him and closest to him. And Anthony Scaramucci fits that bill, as the president would say, plus plus. And as I said, he's been trying to get Scaramucci into his White House for some time. I just want to go back to what you just read that Reince Priebus gave me in terms of a statement about this. Again, Priebus told me, I support Anthony 100%. We go back a long, long way and are very good friends. All good here. That's from Reince. I can tell you that Sarah Murray has done reporting about the fact that that might not be a mutual feeling, John, that Scaramucci has told people that he thinks that Reince is to blame. True or not, I'm just saying that this is Scaramucci's feeling. Reince is to blame for Scaramucci not being in the administration to begin with. So this is going to be a relationship that, you know, could be fraught with some tension in a big way. We see now, again, from this on-the-record statement from Reince, that he is trying to smooth that over before Scaramucci officially walks in the door, saying, no, 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 we're fine, everything's fine, because technically Reince is his boss. But Reince also knows that the New York wing is growing and expanding and closing in, and that Reince, who is, you know, the Washington wing, if you will, and his world is shrinking. The guy who he is incredibly close with, Sean Spicer, brought in, they worked hand in glove, obviously, over at the RNC, is gone. So I think that this is a relationship that we should watch. And to your point about why does it matter, it matters because it puts into question how the president will approach communications and everything else with people who he perceives as his people closer to him.
All right, Dan Abesh, continuing her reporting on this breaking news story. I just want to say we're also getting word that the president has been pushing for this for some time from our correspondents. That sources telling them the president's been pushing to make this, to pull the trigger and make Anthony Scaramucci the communications director for some time. Obviously, it was some just you would debate these things in a White House anyway, whether how deep of a debate and how big of a divide. Sometimes the truth and what people say in their public statements is not always factual. That's smart for any organization. I'm not making too much of that. You don't want to air your public laundry. So back to this point now. Sean Spicer's out. If you are the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, or the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, when you do business with the White House, the people with whom you have relationships are the Sean Spicers and the Reince Priebuses, the people who have been in Washington for some time. That we have had repeatedly, Mike Pence, but we have had repeatedly through this administration frustrations from key members of Congress, key members of the outside interest groups who say they are told by these officials in the White House, senior officials in the White House, this is the plan, this is the president's decision, this is what we are going to do. They plan based on those, and then the plans blow up, either because of something the president says, or it just turns out that that establishment faction thought it had carried the debate and thought it had the upper hand, but in the end, it doesn't.
Yeah, and that's why the sort of decline of the Washington wing is so important too, because it's not only just whether or not they have power in the White House, but that radiates out to larger Washington, to the GOP chairman across the country, governors, the Republican governors, and now that has been weakened. And you always hear from Republicans that was their sort of assurance, right? That was their assurance that the Trump administration would be okay because they would have those voices in the White House in the form of Reince Priebus, in the form of Sean Spicer, and now that appears to be weakening and possibly taken away. We'll see what happens with Reince.
It's also an explanation of why you've seen this phenomenon lately, which is that you have all of the Republican members of Congress having to deal with the influence of Trump and what Trump says and whether that's going to affect the base that has to vote for them in 2 years or 4 years or whatever, but not really wanting him to get involved in the policy details of crafting health care in the Senate, for example, or anything else going forward that Trump's, tweeting, impromptu tweeting or otherwise speaking about things, being mean, for example, or any number of other things you could say, could undermine their efforts. So they know that they have to remain in contact with him and considering what his power is, and yet they want to kind of keep him as at arm's length as possible when it comes to the nitty-gritty.
And one thing we haven't talked about is how this might affect the rest of the press shop. I mean, the press team is not made up just of Sean Spicer and Sarah Sanders. There's an entire group of spokespeople and deputy spokespeople and assistant spokespeople who report to them who are very loyal to Sean, and Sarah is also very loyal to Sean. So what that will mean in terms of whether, as John was asking earlier, it's a really strategic shakeup or whether people now just exit because of something like this happening, that's something that will have ramifications further down the line as well.
Yeah, and they still don't have, I guess, their talk that would Sarah Huckabee Sanders replace Sean Spicer at all. She might not even want that job. Are they going to be on camera now because they haven't been on camera? We'll see what happens. I mean, you asked the question of if this is sort of a reset, is it doubling down, is it a new strategy? I think betting on resets from this White House is seemingly a losing proposition pretty often.
Well, I mean, the good Lord, as communications director, can't help you if the principal brings the New York Times into the Oval Office and trashes his own attorney general, the former FBI director, the #2 at the Justice Department, and the special counsel investigation. It just, I'm sorry, it's just, these are the president's choices. He is perfectly entitled to make these choices about what he says and what he does. But he has been told repeatedly by Sean Spicer, by Reince Priebus, including by Steve Bannon at times, by his outside advisors, by his lawyers, please don't do these things, and he continues to do them.
The president often says, and people say around him, that he's his own best spokesman, that he is someone who can deliver his message most effectively. We have seen time and time again where he has blown up the best laid plans, that the people around him in the West Wing who are crafting a strategy. Look at this week. How many times did he shift his stance on healthcare, what he wanted to see there? And he believes he is his best advocate, but yet he's getting in his own way. I think that he believes that Scaramucci is someone who he knows, who he likes, who he respects as a fighter, can sort of be Trump Jr. on TV.
Yeah. There's no doubt that a lot of these wounds are self-inflicted, but the other thing that's true now is that he's got a lot more people around him to point the finger at and blame, whether or not it's their fault. And you had a skeleton crew on the campaign, which is what he always goes back to every time the going gets tough, talking about what he did on the campaign and why it won, even though nobody thought that it would. And if he's kind of feeling like, oh, okay, to close his ranks back around himself, maybe it won't be so many problems to deal with because he's not very good at taking blame.
There is, of course, a sense of shock. Some will be happy, some will be sad, some will just be uncertain about the big news today. The White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer submitting his resignation as the president turns to a Wall Street hand, not a veteran Washington hand, Anthony Scaramucci, to be the new White House communications director. Our White House correspondent Jim Acosta has some inside information on just why the president wanted this to happen and then why Mr. Spicer decided it was time to go. Jim?
Yeah, John, I talked to a source close to the White House just a few moments ago about all of this, and it sounds like there is a lot of turmoil going on behind the scenes in this press shop, in this communication shop. I am told by a source close to the White House that Trump wanted Scaramucci on television, essentially as a surrogate for the White House. He likes the way Scaramucci performs on television and wanted to give him a more formal title. But according to this source, John, there was simply no understanding by the president that the communications director title comes with lots of responsibilities, not just going on television. And get this, the president was expecting in all of this, as he was tapping Scaramucci for this job, he was expecting Sean Spicer to stay on as press secretary and essentially as the communications director, while Scaramucci would play this ceremonial role, essentially have the title, but go on TV as a surrogate for the White House. I mean, it is very clear, John, that, and we've been having these battles in the press briefing room for the last several months, that the president just did not have confidence in Sean Spicer in that sort of TV job as the press secretary, which John, from so many years covering all of this. The White House press secretary is a TV job. If you can't do this job on television, you are not going to stay in the good graces of this president. And all we have to do is mention two words, Melissa McCarthy. I mean, Sean Spicer was raked over the coals publicly, culturally, as the press secretary, and he was just not living up to Donald Trump TV standards. This is a president who understands television perhaps better than any president who's ever served in the Oval Office,
And the president simply wanted a better TV performer to sort of be front and center for this White House, and it sounded like he had settled on Scaramucci for this job. But according to the source close to the White House, Sean Spicer was just not going to have that. And there was a feeling that that the president did not understand that the job of communications director is more than just being a surrogate on television. And as you and I know, and so many others know here at CNN, sometimes the president judges how his communications is going for the White House based simply on what he sees on the shows, what he sees on the multiple cable news networks, who's speaking on behalf of his administration, how they're performing, and so on. But what he doesn't understand, if you go back to past administrations, people like Jennifer Palmieri and the Obama administration and so on, the job of a communications director is somebody who crafts the message for the White House, who makes sure that the White House is getting the president out there to do a health care event, to push the repeal of Obamacare and so on. And according to this source, the president was just not understanding that there are so many other things that go on with the job of communications director. Sean was doing both of those jobs for so many weeks now, and I think because of that dissatisfaction, Sean decided, as others have been saying here on CNN, that it was time to go. John?
Jim Acosta sharing additional reporting on the big day at the White House. The press secretary, Sean Spicer, is out. He resigns. The president hiring a new communications director, Anthony Scaramucci, as Jim just noted, presumably to be in a more on-camera presence. That's not traditional for the communications director. For those of you watching in the United States and around the world, obviously Sean Spicer has become a familiar face back to the campaign, but especially in the Trump White House days, 6-month mark yesterday. One of the things we have seen in recent days, number one, in recent weeks there have been fewer and fewer on-camera briefings at the White House. That part of a communication strategy at the White House, also part of the president's dissatisfaction with what he views as the quality of those on-camera presentations. Number two, though, we saw from Sean Spicer, we've seen this from other deputies too, a reluctance to talk about certain issues for fear that the president might then contradict them. Listen to Sean Spicer here when asked a pretty simple question. Does the president believe that Russia interfered in the 2016 presidential election?
Does President Trump believe that the Russian government interfered in the 2016 elections?
I think I have not sat down and talked to him about that specific thing. Obviously, we've been dealing with a lot of other issues today. I'd be glad to touch base.
Generally speaking, I mean, this conversation about Russian interference in our elections, there's 16 intelligence agencies that say that they did. The former FBI director said that without a doubt the Russians interfered.
I understand. I've seen the reports.
Does the president share those views?
I've not sat down and asked him about his specific reaction to him, so I'd be glad to touch base and get back to you.
Worth noting, that was not the first week of the administration. That was last month. That was last month. That was 5 months into the Trump administration, and a White House press secretary afraid to answer a pretty basic question. I have not sat down and talked to him about it. It tells you a couple of things. Number one, he's afraid to speak for the president because he's